In this short video, I want to take a look at some of the concepts in Chapter 2. This will be a brief look at them, and it is about mobile networks. But you notice I put under here the word cell phones. Now, I think of mobile as much more than cell phones, but there's a reason I put it this way. It turns out that for whatever reason, our textbook uses the term mobile almost exclusively to talk about cell phones. It ignores the fact that laptops and tablets and personal wearable devices, such as smartwatches and so forth, are also mobile devices. I don't know why it ignores them, it just does. Early wireless phones predated cell phones. We would have these wireless phones that we could put in our house, and you had a base unit that would sit in your living room, and then you could walk around your house, even a little ways outside your house. If you get too far on the other side of the property, you might lose the signal. But that's what we had prior to cell phones. Now, these operated on frequencies that are now used by Wi-Fi and then a few other frequencies too. In fact, the early cordless phones were operated down here at 27 megahertz. Now, that is a very, very low frequency. The nice thing about these very low frequencies is that they can carry a long ways. And you could probably get to the other side of my 1 acre property and still have a signal or close to it. They also had kind of a second generation one that could carry better voice quality at around 46 to 49 megahertz. Those were pretty good. Later on, though, we began to introduce these 900 megahertz, 2.4 gigahertz, and 5.8 gigahertz frequencies in cordless phones. These are the exact same sets of frequencies that we use now in Wi-Fi. Of course, they get much better voice quality. However, you lose, and particularly at these higher ranges like 5.8, you lose that distance. So you were tied more to the inside of your house, perhaps, with those cordless phones. Today, of course, we have the cellular phone system, and it's made up of these antennas that you've probably seen around your neighborhood. The very common antennas here are these sector antennas. They're quite often six-sided, and they're divided so that they can broadcast out into these pie-shaped cells. And in fact, each of these are cells. So this tower in particular will support 6 cells. They're also tilted downward, as you can see here in this third image, so that, of course, they're a little bit better ground coverage. Now, trying to keep up with the terminology of these cell systems can be a little bit tricky, but let's introduce these 5 parts of the cell system. These are certainly not exhaustive, but the tower itself is called a base transceiver station, or BTS. So the next time you're out with your family somewhere, look up at one of those towers and say, oh, look, it's a BTS. They won't know what you're talking about, but you'll feel smug. Each area served makes up a cell, as we saw right back here. We have 6 cells here because we have 6 antennas. Signals from these cells are transmitted, usually by fiber optic cable, although sometimes copper or microwave, to something called a base controller station, or BCS. You'll sometimes see this also as BSC, or base station controller. Now, mobile BCSs, typically around 30 or so, are attached to a mobile switching center, or MSC. I don't believe our book mentions MSCs. That's something I've just thrown in a little bit extra here. And then these are arranged in a mesh topology, very similar to how the internet arranges routers in a mesh topology in order to be able to move data wherever you want to move it. Well, we do have a picture about it. And here's our picture. So you see I've got these towers here, and I've got multiple towers attached to this BCS, this controller station here. And many of these controller stations then might be attached to one MSC, and then these MSCs are arranged in a mesh pattern so that information can get from anywhere to anywhere else. And you notice it can get through even if one of these lines goes down. Now, these lines are not wireless lines. Even though it's wireless to get from your phone to the tower, the rest is all wired. There are wires to get from the tower to the BCS, wires to get from the BCS to the MSC, and then wires all around the MSC system. So it's not entirely wireless, but it appears wireless. Now, each of these towers, remember, creates 6 cells. Now, some towers create more, some less. It depends on the tower and the types of antennas being used. Now, not all cells are created equal. Adjacent cells on a tower transmit and receive at varying frequencies. Why would they do that? Well, you need to avoid interference. Go back here. Let's take another look back here at this image, and you'll see these colored areas. Well, this is overlap between these cells. So if we had these at the same frequency, and we had something talking on this cell and another phone talking on this cell, these would overlap and they would create some interference with each other. We don't want that. And so what we do is we vary the frequencies from one antenna to another antenna so that we can avoid that interference from one cell to another cell. Now, the cell sizes are chosen depending on the number of customers that we need to serve. It is more difficult and more technically challenging to serve a lot of customers in a cell. So we don't make these large cells if we don't have to put that much money into a cell that is only going to service a few people. Macro cells can go from 6 to 25 miles approximately. Micro cells 1.2 miles. Pico cells maybe 650 feet. So we have these different kinds of, first of all, different frequencies, and then different types of cells based on the need we have for that customer base. Now, cells work by multiplexing, and we're going to talk about this in the next couple of slides. So let's get the idea of multiplexing down. Multiplexing refers to the ability to carry more than one conversation at a time on the same frequency or on the same wire. There are three main types of multiplexing, and then there are some more sophisticated things that we're using today to get even higher amounts of information on one line. But the three primary ones that you hear of most are frequency division multiplexing, or FDM. I didn't put the FDM down here, but sometimes you'll also see FDMA, either frequency division multiplexing or frequency division multiple access. This is one conversation in one frequency range and another conversation in another frequency range. You can easily picture this if you picture two people playing the same piano. One person is playing a tune down on the low notes, and another one is playing a tune on a higher frequency up on the upper notes. And they can be playing two different tunes at the same time. And it's not hard for you and I, with our hearing, to be able to hear both tunes and pick out one tune or the other tune and to focus in on just that one tune. That's exactly how this works. The receiver is trained to focus either on the high ranges or the low ranges, or of course several in between. You can make more than two, obviously, by doing this. And so that's how we can get multiple conversations at the same time. Time division multiplexing is a little bit different. This just simply takes turns for very short amounts of time. This is very similar to the way computers time share. They give one application a little bit of time and then another application a little bit of time. This is the same idea. You have several conversations and they're coming in order. From conversation A, you get a packet, and then conversation B, you get a packet, and conversation C, you get a packet, and then you get A again, B again, C again. And so those can be separated at the receiver into three different conversations. Code division multiplexing is a little bit more technical, a little bit more complicated to try to explain. I'm not going to try to get into the complicated technicalities of how it works. Essentially, you can think of it as different coded conversations that the receiver can apply the key to so that it can unravel the conversation it's interested in. Think of it as, say, 5 different people in the room, and they're all speaking a different language. And you, as the listener, happen to know French or Spanish or English, and you can pick out the conversation that you're listening to. That's kind of how code division multiplexing works. Now, this is our last slide, and we're going to put to use this little bit we know about multiplexing right now. This is a very, very brief history of cell technology. First of all, we had 1G, We didn't call it 1G. By the way, that's just first generation. That's all that means. And it's the very early cell system. These were actually analog. They were not digital signals. They were analog, in other words, similar to sound, like we were talking about with the piano. And indeed, they are frequency division multiplexing, so that you have some high frequencies and some low frequencies going on at the same time, just like I was talking about with the piano. And the receiver can separate them and only listen to the high frequencies or only listen to the low frequencies. 2G systems came out a little bit later, and there were two popular technologies being used. There was GSM that was used in Europe, and CDMA, which was used in the United States. Now, GSM was a time division multiplexing system, and CDMA was, as you can figure out here, code division multiple access or code division multiplexing. Now, these were both still circuit switched. In other words, you still had to have a dedicated circuit for every conversation going. We had not yet introduced packet switching, which we talked about back in chapter 1. But these were no longer analog. These were now digital signals. They were just on their own individual circuits. By the way, because they were digital, now we could use them for text messaging, for example. There was sort of an intermediate one introduced later called the GPRS system that AT&T introduced. It was not a real important one, although, historically, if you're into that stuff, you might want to know about it. But we're going to skip over that now and go straight to 3G, which introduced faster data rates and used the same multiplexing techniques as 2G did. There was both time division, there was code division. We used a combination of both of them, but we did have some other ways that we made it faster. And this was the first time we really began to have fast enough systems that we could move data across our phones, for example, that we could tie into, say, a web server. This was because we used wider bands. We used a more sophisticated coding system. I'm not going to get into how that works because it's, again, very complicated, but it's fun if you really want to get into it. It's not above understanding of somebody beginning in this field. 4G, not too long ago, in fact, many of you are still probably on 4G. This introduced something called LTE, and it had many more improvements in basically how it receives radio waves, how the antennas work, and so on. Beam forming, in other words, the way that you transmit a beam such that you can focus it very carefully on where you want it to go. Something called MIMO, M-I-M-O, which means multi-in, multi-out. This is the ability for multiple antennas to pick up a signal that's being reflected off of other surfaces, off the ground, off the walls, and all over the place, and mathematically put them back together so that you don't lose data that you would have otherwise lost. It's, again, very complicated. When you see, for example, Wi-Fi routers with multiple antennas, they are using MIMO. And don't think of it as one antenna receiving one channel and another antenna receiving another channel. That's not what's going on. Well, it is on some of the later ones, MU-MIMO. Moo-MIMO, let's call. But for now, I don't want to get into Moo-MIMO. Let's just talk about MIMO, which was very simply taking reflected frequencies and mathematically putting them back together. It also used some very high density coding techniques. 5G, well, many of you are told that you're on 5G today, but it's not what was promised. 5G actually uses millimeter wave technology that is very, very, very high frequencies. Unfortunately, when you get to these extremely high frequencies, you don't get a signal very far. In fact, that signal has a hard time getting through a decent window in your house, much less the walls and around trees and things like that. So we expected 5G to have so much data that we would forget about Wi-Fi and just use 5G for everything because the capacity was supposed to just be incredible gigabytes of information per second and so on. Didn't really happen. What we're actually using is mainly older LTE technology. Actually, what the companies did, the cell phone companies, is really just begin providing wider coverage of 4G and calling it 5G. Now, there is some other technology going on that's making it better slowly, but it is not the 5G that we were supposed to have. All right, that's it for this one. In the next video, we're going to go over a few of the extra notes that are in Chapter 2.